The piercing wail of my alarm clock jolted me awake, its shrill cry a stark reminder that another day in my personal hell was about to begin. I'm Mary Martinez, and 3 months ago, my life in the picturesque town of Millbrook, Connecticut, transformed from a Norman Rockwell painting into a Hitchcock thriller. As I dragged myself out of bed, my eyes fell on the framed photo on my nightstand, John and I on our wedding day, 13 years ago. My fingers traced the outline of his face, remembering a time when his smile was genuine, when his eyes held love instead of guilt. I sighed, pushing away the memories as I prepared for another Sunday at Grace Community Church. Standing before the bathroom mirror, I scrutinized my reflection. At 35, I still turned heads. But lately, those admiring glances had morphed into pitying stares. The woman staring back at me looked tired, her eyes holding a sadness that no amount of concealer could hide. As I reached for my lipstick, my hand froze. There, on John's discarded shirt collar, was a telltale smudge of candy apple red, Karen's signature shade. Karen Thompson, my best friend. The woman who held my hand through my miscarriage 2 years ago. The same woman who now held my husband's heart in her perfectly manicured hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. While I nurtured other people's children as a third-grade teacher at Pine Grove Elementary, Karen had effortlessly given John what I couldn't, the promise of a family. But it wasn't just the affair that was tearing me apart. No, Karen's betrayal ran deeper, more insidious. She'd been systematically destroying my reputation in our tight-knit community. Every sympathetic glance, every hushed conversation that stopped when I entered a room, every pitying smile, all Karen's handiwork. As I dressed for church, I could almost hear the whispers that would greet me. "Poor Mary," they'd say, too focused on other people's children to give John his own. The cruelty of it stung, but I forced myself to stand tall. In small towns like Millbrook, reputation is everything, and I refused to let Karen strip me of the last shreds of my dignity. Driving to church, I passed the familiar landmarks of our town. The quaint storefronts, the manicured lawns, the white picket fences, all seemed to mock me now, reminders of the perfect life I thought I had. As I pulled into the church parking lot, I spotted John's car already there. Of course, he'd arrived early. Karen had choir practice before the service. Steeling myself, I entered the church, the scent of polished wood and old hymnals enveloping me. I took my usual seat in the third row, trying to ignore the hushed conversations around me. As the organ began to play and the choir filed in, my eyes locked on Karen. There she stood, radiant in her white robe, her voice soaring above the others as she sang about faith and redemption. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw something flicker in her gaze. Was it guilt? Triumph? Before I could decide, she looked away, her attention on John, who sat in the front row, unable to tear his eyes from her. The sight made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to remain composed. As Pastor David began his sermon on forgiveness and turning the other cheek, a plan started to form in my mind. You see, being a teacher for 12 years teaches you more than just how to handle unruly children. It teaches you to observe, to understand patterns, and most importantly, to recognize weakness. Karen's weakness? Her desperate need to maintain her perfect image. And in that moment, as I sat in that pew, listening to platitudes about forgiveness, I made a decision. Karen Thompson had underestimated me, thinking I was just a quiet, meek schoolteacher. She had no idea that sometimes the quietest people carry the deadliest plans. As the service ended and the congregation began to file out, I plastered on my best smile and approached Karen. "Wonderful singing today," I said, my voice dripping with honey. "We simply must catch up soon. How about coffee this week?" Karen's surprise was evident, but she quickly masked it with her practiced smile. "Of course, Mary. That would be lovely." As I walked away, I could feel her eyes boring into my back, trying to decipher my sudden friendliness. Little did she know I was about to teach her the most valuable lesson of her life. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is served with a smile. Walking to my car, I felt a newfound energy coursing through my veins. The path ahead would be challenging, requiring patience and cunning I wasn't sure I possessed. But as I looked back at the church, watching Karen laugh with her circle of admirers, John hovering nearby, I knew one thing for certain. This quiet schoolteacher was about to give Karen Thompson a lesson she'd never forget. The following week unfolded like a slow-motion car crash, each day bringing new revelations and deeper wounds. I found myself hyper-aware of every glance, every whisper, every subtle shift in the social dynamics of our small town. It was as if my newfound determination had sharpened my senses, allowing me to see the intricate web of lies and manipulation Karen had woven around us all. Monday morning arrived with a bitter chill, matching the cold dread in my stomach as I prepared for another day at Pine Grove Elementary. As I entered my classroom, the familiar scent of chalk dust and crayons usually brought comfort. But today, it felt suffocating. I began setting up for the day, my movements mechanical, my mind elsewhere. It was during my free period that I overheard two mothers whispering in the hallway, their voices carrying through the partially open door. "Poor John," one said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy, stuck with Mary, who's too focused on other people's children to give him his own. The other woman clucked her tongue in agreement, adding, "I heard she can't even, you know." Their giggles faded as they moved down the hall, leaving me frozen in place, my red marking pen leaking onto my favorite cream blouse. The stain spread, a vivid reminder of the blood-red lipstick on John's collar. As I dabbed at it futilely, something inside me snapped. This wasn't just about John's infidelity anymore. This was about Karen systematically destroying everything I had built: my reputation, my friendships, my sense of self-worth. And I was done being a passive victim. That evening, instead of grading papers, I found myself poring over social media, community newsletters, and church bulletins from the past few years. Patterns began to emerge, subtle at first, then glaringly obvious. Karen's rise to social prominence coincided with a series of scandals and fallings out among our town's elite. Each time, Karen had somehow benefited, climbing higher on the social ladder while leaving a trail of broken relationships in her wake. As the week progressed, I started paying closer attention to the gossip mill that churned through our small town. Karen always seemed to be at the center of it, not obviously spreading rumors, but subtly guiding conversations, planting seeds of doubt about others while building herself up. It was masterful, really, if it hadn't been so destructive. Wednesday. Brought the weekly book club meeting, hosted as always at Karen's immaculate home. I debated not going, but something compelled me to attend. As I entered her perfectly decorated living room, the conversation hushed momentarily before resuming with forced cheerfulness. Karen greeted me with a hug that felt more like a stranglehold, her perfume cloying and suffocating. "Mary, darling, so glad you could make it," she cooed, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "We were just discussing this month's book. You did finish it, didn't you?" I smiled back, matching her saccharine tone. "Of course, Karen. I found the protagonist's journey particularly enlightening." The truth was, I hadn't read a single page, but neither, I suspected, had Karen. As the discussion progressed, it became clear that while Karen was happy to host these gatherings, she rarely contributed any meaningful insights about the books themselves. It was during a lull in the conversation that Betty Miller, the baker's wife, mentioned her struggles with the homeless shelter's upcoming bake sale. "I just don't know how I'll manage to bake enough for both the shelter and the church sale," she sighed. Karen's eyes lit up. "Oh, don't you worry about the church sale, Betty. I'll handle that myself. You focus on the shelter. Such important work you're doing there." Betty looked relieved. but something in Karen's tone made me pause. I remembered Karen's famous apple pie from last year's sale, the one that had won first prize. Suddenly, a piece of the puzzle clicked into place. As the meeting wound down, I lingered, helping Karen clear away the coffee cups. "That's so generous of you to bake for the church sale," I said casually. "Your apple pie was such a hit last year. Maybe you could share the recipe?" Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "Oh, it's an old family secret. I couldn't possibly share it." I nodded understanding, but inside, my mind was racing. The next day, I made a point of stopping by Miller's Bakery, ostensibly to order cupcakes for my class. As Betty bustled about, I casually mentioned Karen's offer to bake for the church sale. Betty's reaction was subtle, a tightening around the eyes, a slight pause in her movements, but it confirmed my suspicions. "That's nice of her," Betty said, her voice carefully neutral. "Her apple pie is always so popular," I pressed gently. "Almost as good as yours." Betty's smile was tight. "Yes, almost." As I left the bakery, pieces were falling into place. Karen's homemade pies, her claims of charity work that no one could quite verify, her constant name-dropping of important connections. It all pointed to a carefully constructed facade. The real breakthrough came through an unexpected source: Linda Thompson, Karen's own sister-in-law. I ran into her at the local coffee shop, a chance encounter that would change everything. Linda looked tired, worn down in a way that seemed at odds with the Thompson family's usual polished appearance. As we chatted, something in Linda's demeanor, a mix of guilt and desperation, made me take a chance. "Linda," I said softly, "is everything okay? You seem troubled." The floodgates opened. Over the next hour, Linda poured out years of pent-up frustrations and secrets. Karen's manipulations weren't new. John wasn't her first married man. She'd done this in their previous town, which was the real reason for their hasty move to Millbrook. "But that's not even the worst of it," Linda whispered, her eyes darting around the nearly empty cafe. "Karen's marriage to Richard, it's all based on lies. She trapped him with a fake pregnancy scare years ago, and she's been bleeding him dry financially ever since." My mind reeled with this new information. Richard Thompson, a respected elder in our church, had no idea that his wife had been systematically destroying other marriages while portraying herself as a pillar of Christian virtue. As the pieces fell into place, a plan began to form in my mind. Karen had built her empire on lies and manipulation, using people's trust and goodwill against them. But in a small town like Millbrook, secrets have a way of coming to light, if someone knows how to bring them into focus. The next few weeks were a delicate balance of investigation and pretense. By day, I continued my routine: teaching, attending church, participating in community events. But in every interaction, I was hyper-aware, collecting information, confirming suspicions, and slowly building a case against Karen. I reconnected with old friends, mended fences with those I'd drifted away from. Each conversation, each shared confidence, added another thread to the tapestry of Karen's deceptions. I learned of charitable donations that never reached their intended recipients, of business deals soured by Karen's behind-the-scenes machinations, of friendships destroyed by well-timed rumors. All the while, I maintained a facade of normalcy. I even managed civil conversations with John, each interaction a knife twisting in my heart. But I noticed changes in him too, a growing unease, a reluctance to meet my eyes. Was he beginning to see through Karen's manipulations or simply feeling guilty about his betrayal? As the annual Women's League dinner approached, Karen's crown jewel event, I knew the time for action was drawing near. Karen had been planning this for months, seeing it as her chance to cement her status as the town's leading lady. Little did she know it would be the beginning of her downfall. The night before the dinner, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence I'd gathered. Emails, bank statements, recorded conversations, each piece a damning indictment of Karen's true nature. My hand hovered over my phone, John's number on the screen. Part of me wanted to warn him, to give him a chance to distance himself from the coming storm. But as I looked at our wedding photo on the wall, I remembered the pain, the humiliation, the shattered trust. No, I decided. John had made his choice. Now it was time for everyone to face the consequences of their actions. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. Tomorrow would change everything, not just for Karen and John, but for our entire community. As I prepared for bed, a strange calm settled over me. The quiet teacher they had all underestimated was about to teach the lesson of a lifetime. Little did I know, the events that would unfold at the Women's League dinner would surpass even my wildest expectations, setting in motion a chain of revelations that would rock our town to its very foundations. The day of the Women's League. Annual dinner arrived with an air of anticipation that seemed to permeate the entire town. As I got ready, slipping into a sleek black dress I'd bought for the occasion, I could almost feel the weight of the USB drive in my clutch, heavy with the secrets it contained. The community center was transformed for the evening, twinkling lights and floral centerpieces creating an atmosphere of elegance. As I entered, I saw Karen holding court near the podium, resplendent in a designer gown that probably cost more than my monthly salary. Our eyes met briefly, and I gave her a small smile, watching confusion flicker across her face at my apparent composure. The evening progressed with the usual speeches and pleasantries. I sat quietly, watching Karen work the room, her laugh tinkling like glass as she moved from group to group. John was there too, hovering at the edges, looking increasingly uncomfortable as the night wore on. Finally, it was time for Karen's keynote address. She took the stage with practiced grace, her voice dripping with false modesty as she began to speak about community values and moral integrity. Our town is only as strong as the bonds between us, Karen was saying, her eyes scanning the room. And it's through our charitable works that we truly show our character. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. Speaking of character, Karen, I said, loud enough to carry across the now silent room. Perhaps you'd like to explain the discrepancies in the charity accounts? Karen's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. I'm sorry, Mary, but this isn't the time or place for... I cut her off, my voice gaining strength. Oh, I think it's exactly the time and place. After all, we're here to celebrate our community's achievements, aren't we? I turned to address the stunned audience. Did you know that none of the checks written to St. Mary's Orphanage were ever cashed? Or that the clothes donated for the Yar homeless shelter somehow ended up being sold at a consignment shop 2 towns over? The room erupted in murmurs. Karen's face had gone pale, her knuckles white as she gripped the podium. These are baseless accusations, she sputtered, but I could see the panic in her eyes. That's when Linda, Karen's sister-in-law, stood up. It's true, she said, her voice shaking. I've known about some of this for a while, but I was too afraid to say anything. The floodgates opened. One by one, people began to stand, each with their own story of Karen's manipulations and lies. Betty Miller revealed how Karen had been taking credit for her baked goods for years. Margaret Wilson, the church treasurer, confirmed the financial discrepancies I'd mentioned. Karen's carefully constructed world was crumbling before our eyes. She tried to regain control, her voice rising hysterically. You're all just jealous. I've done so much for this town. That's when I played my final card. I connected the USB drive to the projector, and suddenly the wall was filled with incriminating emails, bank statements, and even security camera footage showing Karen removing cash from the church donation box. The gasps were audible. Richard Thompson, Karen's husband, stood up, his face ashen. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The miscarriage last year, was that a lie too?" Karen's mask finally cracked completely. In a moment of uncontrolled rage, she screamed, "You all wanted to believe the lies, every single one of you. You loved my parties, my donations, my perfect life. You needed me." As if on cue, the doors opened and 2 police officers entered. Someone, I later learned it was Margaret, had called them after seeing the extent of Karen's financial fraud. The sight of Karen being read her rights, still in her expensive gown, was surreal. But the real shock came from what happened next. As she was being led away, Karen turned to me, her eyes blazing with a mixture of hatred and something that looked almost like respect. "You!" she hissed. "I never saw you coming." I met her gaze steadily. "That was your mistake, Karen. You underestimated me, just like you underestimated everyone in this room." As Karen was escorted out, the room erupted into chaos. People were crying, shouting, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I felt a hand on my arm and turned to see John, his face a mask of shame and regret. "Mary," he began, but I cut him off. "Save it, John. This isn't about us anymore." As I looked around the room, at the shattered but slowly healing community, I realized that this was just the beginning. The truth was out, but the real work of rebuilding trust and healing wounds was yet to come. In that moment, standing amidst the wreckage of Karen's lies, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The quiet teacher had spoken, and her lesson had changed everything. Little did I know, the repercussions of this night would continue to unfold in ways none of us could have predicted. The days following the Women's League dinner were a whirlwind of activity and emotion. As news of Karen's deceptions spread through Millbrook, it was as if a fog had lifted from the town. People began to see clearly for the first time in years, and the process of healing and rebuilding began. For me, the aftermath was a complex mix of vindication and unexpected challenges. While many praised me for exposing the truth, others viewed me with suspicion, wondering what else I might know about them. The very traits that had allowed me to uncover Karen's lies, my observant nature and quiet persistence, now made some of my neighbors uncomfortable. One particularly difficult moment came when I returned to school the Monday after the dinner. As I walked into the teacher's lounge, conversations halted abruptly. My colleagues eyed me warily, unsure how to act around the woman who had brought down the town's social queen. Principal Rogers called me into his office, his face a mask of concern. "Mary," he began hesitantly, "some parents have expressed concerns about having their children in your class. They worry you might be watching their families too closely." The irony of being punished for doing the right thing wasn't lost on me. But as I looked at Principal Rogers, I saw not judgment, but a plea for help. "What do you suggest we do?" I asked calmly. His relief was palpable. Together, we crafted a plan to host a series of community-building events at the school, giving me a chance to reconnect with parents and students in a positive way. It wasn't easy. There were uncomfortable silences and probing questions. But slowly, trust began to rebuild. At home, the silence was deafening. John had moved out the day after the dinner, leaving behind a note full of apologies that rang hollow after years of deception. As I walked through our half-empty house, I was struck by how little I missed him. The betrayal had carved out any lingering affection, leaving behind a strange sense of freedom. It was in this space of newfound independence that I began to rediscover parts of myself I had long neglected. I pulled out old sketchbooks, reigniting a passion for art that I had set aside when I became a teacher. I joined a local hiking group, pushing my body to new limits as I explored the beautiful trails around Millbrook. But the real growth came through my interactions with others affected by Karen's actions. Betty Miller, the baker whose recipes Karen had stolen, approached me one day after church. I never thanked you properly, she said, her eyes brimming with tears. For years, I thought I wasn't good enough, that my pies weren't really special. But now, she squeezed my hand. Now, I remember who I am. Inspired by Betty's words, I started a support group for those dealing with the aftermath of Karen's manipulations. We met weekly in the church basement, sharing stories and strategies for moving forward. It was during one of these meetings that I had an epiphany. Our pain could be transformed into something positive. With the group's enthusiastic support, we launched a community renewal project. We organized fundraisers to replace the money Karen had stolen. But more than that, we worked to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. We started a mentorship program, pairing longtime residents with newcomers to create genuine connections. We revitalized the town's neglected community garden, turning it into a symbol of growth and resilience. As spring turned to summer, I found myself busier than ever, but also more fulfilled. My classroom became a hub of creativity and open communication. As I applied the lessons I had learned to my teaching, we talked about integrity, about the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, and about the power of community. One warm evening, as I was tending to the tomato plants in the community garden, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Richard Thompson, Karen's husband, looking older and wearier than I remembered. "Mary," he said softly, "I owe you an apology. I should have seen what was happening. I should have stopped it." I stood, brushing dirt from my hands. "We all played a part in allowing Karen's deceptions to continue," I said. "The important thing is what we do now." Richard nodded, his eyes focusing on the thriving garden around us. "I've been thinking about that a lot. I want to make amends, to give back to the community I helped harm, even if unknowingly. Do you think... could I help here?" As I showed Richard around the garden, explaining our various projects, I felt a sense of things coming full circle. Here was a man who had lost everything, finding a new purpose in the very community his wife had nearly destroyed. That night, as I sat on my porch, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I reflected on how far we had all come. The path of healing wasn't easy or straightforward, but with each small act of kindness, each moment of vulnerability shared, we were creating something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. I thought of Karen, now facing the consequences of her actions in a jail cell. I no longer felt anger towards her, only a deep sadness for the emptiness that must have driven her to such extremes. In exposing her lies, I had not only freed our community, but also, in a way, freed Karen from the web of deception she had woven around herself. As I closed my eyes, listening to the night sounds of our small town, I felt a profound sense of peace. The quiet teacher had found her voice, and in doing so had helped an entire community rediscover its strength and unity. Little did I know, the journey of growth and healing was far from over, and the biggest challenges, and most profound, revelations were yet to come. 6 months after the fateful Women's League dinner, Millbrook was preparing for its annual Founders' Day celebration. The event had always been a showcase of our town's unity and traditions, but this year it carried a deeper significance. It was our first major gathering since Karen's deceptions had come to light, and everyone felt the weight of this new beginning. As head of the organizing committee, a position I'd reluctantly accepted at the town's insistence, I found myself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. We had decided to use the celebration as a way to not only honor our past, but also redefine our future. The theme was rebuilding trust, renewing community, and the response had been overwhelming. The morning of the celebration dawned bright and clear. As I stood on the town square, overseeing the final preparations, I couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The old hierarchies had crumbled, replaced by a new sense of equality and shared purpose. People who had never spoken before were now working side by side, setting up booths and hanging decorations. But beneath the surface of renewed community, spirit, tensions still simmered. Not everyone had been happy with the changes brought about by Karen's exposure. Some, who had benefited from the old system, resented the new openness and accountability we were striving for. As the square began to fill with townspeople, I noticed a commotion near the entrance. To my shock, I saw Karen Thompson making her way through the crowd. She had been released on bail pending her trial, but this was the first time she had shown her face in public since her arrest. The buzz of conversation died as people noticed her presence. Karen, once the picture of elegance and confidence, now looked small and uncertain. Her designer clothes had been replaced by a simple sundress, her perfectly coiffed hair now hanging limp around her face. As she approached the center of the square, I steeled myself for a confrontation. But when Karen's eyes met mine, I saw something I never expected: genuine remorse. "Mary," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you." Before I could respond, John appeared at Karen's side. My heart clenched at the sight of my estranged husband, but his next words stunned me. "Mary, please," John pleaded, "just hear us out. We owe you and the entire town an explanation." The crowd had gone silent, all eyes on this unexpected drama, unfolding in their midst. I could feel the weight of their expectation, their desire for closure and justice. Taking a deep breath, I nodded and led Karen and John to a quiet corner of the square. What happened next was a confession that shook Millbrook to its core. Karen, her voice shaking, revealed the full extent of her deceptions, not just in our town, but in the 2 previous communities she had lived in. She spoke of a childhood marred by neglect and insecurity, of a desperate need for validation that had twisted into a pathological desire for control and admiration. John, for his part, admitted to his weakness in falling for Karen's manipulations. He spoke of how he had been seduced not just by her charm, but by the illusion of importance and influence she offered. As they spoke, I noticed Richard Thompson standing at the edge of the crowd, his face a mask of pain and betrayal. It was clear that he, like the rest of us, was hearing the full truth for the first time. The revelations didn't stop there. Karen, in a final act of atonement, handed me a thick folder. "This contains everything," she said, her eyes brimming with tears. "All the financial records, the names of everyone I manipulated or blackmailed. I'm ready to face the consequences of my actions." As I flipped through the pages, my heart sank. The extent of Karen's manipulations was far greater than any of us had imagined. It implicated prominent members of our community, revealed long-buried secrets, and exposed systemic issues that went beyond one woman's deceptions. I looked up to see the entire town watching, waiting to see how I would respond. In that moment, I realized that the true test of our community wasn't in exposing the lies, but in how we chose to move forward from this point. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the makeshift stage we had set up for the celebration's opening ceremony. The microphone felt heavy in my hand as I addressed the crowd. "Friends, neighbors," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. Today was meant to be a celebration of our past and a looking forward to our future. Instead, we find ourselves at a crossroads. The information in this folder could tear our community apart. Or, I paused, looking out at the sea of faces. Faces of people I had known my entire life. Faces etched with worry, hope, and expectation. Or, I continued, we can use this as an opportunity to truly rebuild. Not just the facade of a perfect community, but a real, honest, compassionate one. One where we acknowledge our mistakes, support each other through hardships, and commit to being better, not for appearance's sake, but because it's the right thing to do. As I spoke, I could see the change in people's expressions. The anger and shock began to give way to thoughtfulness, even resolve. "I propose," I said, my voice gaining strength, "that we use today not for celebration, but for reflection and planning. Let's break into groups, discuss these issues openly, and start the hard work of genuine healing and growth. The silence that followed my words was deafening. For a moment, I feared I had misjudged, that the weight of the truth was too much for our fragile community to bear. Then, from the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "I'm in." It was Betty Miller, the baker whose recipes Karen had stolen. Others joined in, voices rising in a chorus of agreement and support. As the crowd began to organize itself, I caught sight of Karen being led away by the sheriff, her brief furlough over, her return to custody necessary as new charges loomed. Our eyes met one last time, and I saw in them a mixture of regret and, surprisingly, gratitude. The Founders' Day celebration had become something entirely unexpected, a true refounding of our community, built on honesty, accountability, and compassion. As I watched my neighbors come together, ready to face hard truths and work towards real solutions, I felt a glimmer of hope. The quiet teacher had spoken, and her lesson had transformed not just a few lives, but an entire town. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time in a long time, I believed that Millbrook's best days might still be ahead of us. The weeks following the Founders' Day revelation were a whirlwind of activity, emotion, and transformation. Millbrook, once a picturesque postcard of small-town America, had become a laboratory for community healing and renewal. The process wasn't easy, but it was profoundly necessary. We started with a series of town hall meetings, each focused on a different aspect of the issues revealed in Karen's documents. The first few were tense, filled with accusations and defensiveness. I found myself playing mediator more often than not, drawing on every ounce of patience I'd cultivated in my years of teaching. "Remember," I often said during these heated discussions, "our goal isn't to assign blame, but to understand how we got here and how we can do better." Slowly, painfully, people began to open up. Long-buried resentments and misunderstandings came to light. We learned that Mayor Johnson's zealous support of Karen's charity initiatives stemmed from guilt over his own past misdeeds. The Petersons, always so quick to judge others, revealed their struggles with their son's addiction, which Karen had used to manipulate them. As secrets were shared and burdens lifted, a new kind of bond began to form among the townspeople. It wasn't the superficial friendliness of before, but something deeper, forged in the fires of truth and vulnerability. One particularly memorable moment came during a discussion about the town's financial future. Richard Thompson, still reeling from the extent of Karen's deceptions, stood up. "I've spent years managing numbers," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "But I never saw the human cost behind them. I want to offer my skills, free of charge, to help any family or business affected by what happened." His offer opened the floodgates. Suddenly, people were volunteering their time and skills left and right. Dr. Patel offered free health checkups. Mr. Gonzalez from the hardware store pledged materials for home repairs. Even teenagers got involved, organizing a tutoring program for younger kids. As for me, I found my role evolving. No longer just a teacher, I became a kind of unofficial counselor and mediator for the town. It was exhausting work, but deeply fulfilling. Every small victory, every moment of genuine connection felt like a step towards healing. John, my estranged husband, approached me one afternoon as I was leaving the school. He looked older, the weight of his choices evident in the lines on his face. "Mary," he said, his voice low, "I know I have no right to ask this, but is there any chance for us?" I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in months. I saw regret, hope, and fear all mingled in his eyes. But I also saw something else, a fundamental weakness that I hadn't allowed myself to acknowledge before. "No, John," I said gently. "What we had is gone." but I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself." As he walked away, I felt a final thread of my old life severing. But instead of pain, I felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. Karen's trial came and went. She pleaded guilty to multiple charges of fraud and embezzlement. Her sentencing was a somber affair, attended by many. From Millbrook. As the judge read out her sentence, 5 years in prison followed by extensive community service, I caught Karen's eye. There was resignation there, but also something else. A glimmer of the person she might have been, might still become. As the eye. Summer turned to fall. Millbrook began to find its new rhythm. The community garden, once Karen's showpiece, became a true collaborative effort. We expanded it, adding a section for teaching kids about nutrition and sustainability. The old social hierarchies dissolved, replaced by a network of mutual support and genuine friendship. One crisp October evening, as I was grading papers on my porch, I heard footsteps on the path. Looking up, I saw Linda, Karen's former sister-in-law, approaching with a hesitant smile. "Mary," she said. "I hope I'm not interrupting. That is, some of us were wondering if you'd consider running for mayor in the upcoming special election." I blinked in surprise. "Me? But I'm just a teacher." Linda's smile widened. "You're not just anything, Mary. You're the heart of what Millbrook has become. We need someone like you to lead us forward." As Linda left, her words echoing in my mind, I gazed out at the town I'd called home my entire life. The streetlights were coming on, casting a warm glow over the familiar houses and shops. But it wasn't the same town anymore. It was stronger, more real, more alive. I thought about the journey we'd been on, the pain and the growth, the shattered illusions and the genuine connections forged in their place. I thought about the quiet teacher who had found her voice and the community that had learned to listen. Maybe it was time for that teacher to step into a new role, to help write the next chapter in Millbrook's story. As the sun set on another day in our changed town, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but we would walk it together. And that, I realized, was the most precious outcome of all. The quiet teacher had spoken, and in finding her voice, she had helped an entire community find its soul. As I stood on my porch, looking out at the town I loved, I knew that the real story of Millbrook, and my own story, was only